Just waiting for everybody to load in. Good morning, everyone. It takes a moment for everyone who's queued up to load in, so we'll give people a few minutes before we kick off. Okay, right, let's get started. So welcome everyone to the 6th LT webinar that we at ADInstruments been running, looking through various aspects of the LT platform. And today we're going to be focusing on advanced authoring. Just a few little introductions and housekeeping rules for the webinar before we start. I'm Tom Broughton. I'm the Technical Support Specialist and Customer Success Manager for ADInstruments Europe. And I'm the expert on LT within our region. And joining us, we've got my colleagues, Paula Croft, Marcus Hughes, and Lucy Murray, who are panelists, and they'll be helping us, helping me answer any questions that crop up during this session. Just to bear in mind, I am going to be muting the chat for the duration of the webinar. If you have a question that you would like to ask during the session, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. This will allow you to kind of more formally ask a question, and we get notified that that question's been asked, and we can either respond via text or we can I can answer it live during the webinar. So you will no longer be able to chat with anyone until the end of the webinar session. This webinar will be recorded as well. So all of our webinar recordings are up on our website. But for now, let's get started. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we can take a look at a few more advanced features of the LT authoring and a few little tips and tricks to help enhance your lesson design. So let me just share my screen here. And I'm just going to hide my controls here, if you bear with me 1 second. Just so there are no black boxes on my screen. So just before we get started, I just want to point out a few places you can go if you have any LT questions or inquiries as a good starting point. First of all, you can go to our website, ADInstruments.com, and you can just go to support and LT. And there's a plethora of video content and getting started resources that you can use of, as well as some FAQ documents and support articles that you can access that might be a good first port of call to answer any questions you may have. We do have an LT community where anyone who uses LT is free to join and discuss tips, tricks, ask questions, give us feedback on how we can improve LT. You can also send us feedback via your user menu within LT itself. So once you're logged in at the top right, if you click on your name, your email address up here, you'll see there's an option to send us some feedback directly, and there are also links to the support site and the LT community there. And finally, you can ask any of us in the ADInstruments team any of your questions directly, and we'll be happy to help. So with that all said, let's go ahead and look at some advanced authoring tips and tricks and features within LT authoring mode. And there will be a few little breaks as we go along to address any questions that are asked or that Marcus would like me, or Marcus or Paula or Lucy would like me to answer in more detail. So I will be pausing periodically to look at any questions that crop up. If there are any interesting ones, we might deviate and just cover some of those questions as we go. So the first thing I wanted to look at is the hotspot panel. Oh, there we go. So this is a relatively new panel type that not a lot of people you may not be aware of it, you may not know how to use it, you may not know what it's useful for. We primarily use this in our anatomy collection, specifically the histology elements. A lot of our anatomy collections have a lab which looks at the macro side and a histology element which looks obviously at the tissue layers. The hotspot panel is ideal for this, and this is found within the basic panels category here. The hotspot panel is located just down here. At a very basic level, the hotspot panel allows you to have layers of images and branching images, allowing you to kind of look at areas of interest in more detail by uploading an image and effectively zooming in. But I'm going to show you how that's actually set up within the LT authoring. So I've got my hotspot panel here already, and I've already added in an initial image here. So I can see here I can change the image. If I had no image, I could kind of add my top level image at this point. But what I then have the option to do is to highlight regions or points of interest in my image and potentially provide the students with a link and into a deeper layer of this particular image. So in this case, I've got the pituitary gland here being shown. And at the very bottom middle of my panel, I have these kind of 3 regions of interest options that I can choose from. So if I choose one of these, I can then either draw a rectangle, I can draw a more freeform area selection, or I could just highlight a singular point. And I'll add all 3 of these in so you can see what they look like. So what I can do is draw a rectangle over the area of interest. And you'll see I then get some additional options here. I'll come to those in a second. I'm just going to draw a few more other options just so you can see what the different features actually do. So I could draw a more freeform region, like so. If I want to highlight a particular shape or a sort of non-rectangular element, I can freeform draw that particular area using that tool. And no, let's undo that. So I should be able to, oh dear, no, let's go back in and delete that. Okay. And I can highlight a point of interest using this little right-hand icon here. So I can just drop this on a particular area. And the freeform and the rectangle areas function identically. But the kind of point is only a singular region that you want to highlight. But the options on each are identical. So what I can do is highlight a region that I want to kind of zoom in down to. I can give this particular region a label. So when the student clicks on it, they get a bit of detail. So I can say, give a description if I want. And then I have the option of changing the color or deleting the region. But I also have the ability to edit layer. So what this will do is allow me to zoom in, and I can then add an additional image in this layer. You'll see at the left-hand side, I have an arrow that allows me to jump back out to the layer above. But for now, I'm going to click Add Image and choose an image to add in there. So I have an image that corresponds with the region that I've selected. There we go. And what I can then do is I can, again, populate this with the same tools. I can use the point selector to say this is the, give it a label. And I can even highlight an area over here. And again, I can do exactly the same thing again. I can highlight a region or a point of interest, and I can add a layer. So again, I'm now zooming in on that region. I can an image. Choose one that I have available. I have my second level image. showing the posterior pituitary in more detail. And I could highlight regions of interest and provide more information there if desired. So I could then zoom back out. I could go to this point of interest and do exactly the same. I could click on that and add in a layer if I wanted to, although I'm not going to. And you can just have as many areas of interest go down a level, highlight other areas of interest, each of those being able to go down a level and view the image in more detail. So it kind of branches within the panel itself. So fairly straightforward to use. Again, I could just highlight this and get rid of it if I don't want it. But it's a useful tool if you're looking at kind of microstructures and things like that. You can have a top level image and allow the students to kind of zoom in almost as if they're using a microscope. But you could use it for pretty much anything. You could have a lab setup and have the different, you know, the beakers and the water jacketing highlighted. Click on those, it zooms in. You can use your imagination to really design whatever you want using the hotspot panel. Just allows you to zoom in on more detail and give the students that perception of kind of zooming in on a particular feature. So quite a useful little function there. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at, and we'll take a little break after this one just to address any questions that have cropped up, is tables, graphs, and linking tables across a whole lesson. So I've got a table here. This is a question table that the students can edit, and they're meant to put in their ECG intervals into this into these cells here. But what I want to do is show you how to actually set up a graph. This is something that people can struggle with sometimes, but also how to have a table that gradually fills in across the lesson and increases in size across the lesson. So being able to link tables to one another, but not have them be identical tables. I'll give a bit more detail on why you might want to do that once we get to that point. So the first thing to note is with a graph, it'll never plot anything until the cells start to be filled in. This is a kind of common error that a lot of people don't realize. They expect, you know, they click select data and they expect to see the axes on the graph. It won't generate any axes or plot any data until the cells actually start to be filled in. So just bear that in mind. It's pretty common that your table is not going to be filled in when the students access it. So the graph itself will look like this until the students actually start filling in data, or they design the table, the graph, depending on how you set it up. So I'm going to click select data, and this will ask me to choose which table on the page, if there are more than one, that I want to use to plot data. So graphs must have a table on the same page to draw data from. So I can click use data from here. And it'll then ask me to dimension my table and kind of tell it which cells I want to use to generate the graph. Obviously, there's kind of a scenario column here. I don't really want to plot that. That's not really any data. So what I can do is highlight the columns and cells, the columns and rows that I want to use to create my table. And I can then choose which type of graph I would like to generate. In this case, I'm going to generate a bar graph just to show the differences in the intervals within my ECG. And if my first column has the x-axis values, I can tell it that's the case. So we can do this and click on OK. And as you can see there, the graph is not actually plotting because, as I said, there has to be data in those cells in order to actually plot it. So if I just hit preview and just start filling in the cells, you can see the graph actually starts to plot. So you need to have at least one data set filled in order for the graph to actually start plotting. It's really important to note that. There's other things, bear in mind that with a graph, you can decide whether you want it to be prefabricated, in which case you would use a basic graph. A basic graph, as with most of the panels in the basic category, can't be edited by students. So This will allow you to design the graph, decide if it's a bar graph and which cells are going to be plotted. If you instead use a question graph, the students will need to design the graph themselves. So they will have to select the appropriate columns and rows. They will have to decide what type of graph it is and design it themselves. So again, it's up to you which of these you want the students to utilize. There is also, if we edit our table, there's also a set view as well. This is just you telling the table which cells you actually want to present to the students. So you could have formulae in some other cells, or you could have some calculations running in the other cells and just plot the result in other visible cells so the students don't see the excess columns. So you can actually decide to only show certain parts of the graph to the students as well using this set view function. Again, it's not something people tend to know what it does, but really you can have, as most of you should be aware, you can have formulae permeating through tables just like you could in Excel, averages, means and things like that, medians, all within the tables. You can have those kind of off the side of the view if you're doing calculations, so the students don't see those excess calculation cells, they just see the end result. Okay, so just bear in mind that graphs require a table. They won't be plotting until at least one data set is filled in by the students. And you'll also notice that there's a little linking icon here telling us that this graph is dependent or tied to another panel. Same with this table, it's telling us that its features are linked to another panel on this page. Okay, now one thing that you could make use of with tables is actually having a table that gradually fills in as you go across as you proceed through the lesson. So as an example here, I'm going to change my view back to my normal table. So what I'm going to do in this case is have the students record their ECG at rest in this particular exercise. They're going to then fill in their values. But on the next set of pages, I'm going to have them record their ECG during exercise, let's say very moderate exercise, and do the same type of analysis. Now, what would be ideal is if I could have the same table, but with an additional row that the students can enter their exercise values into. And this is where table linking comes in. Now, we're going to talk about aliasing shortly, but when it comes to having a table that gradually increases in size as you progress through the lesson, you cannot alias the table because an aliased panel, which we'll come to shortly, is dynamically linked to all other aliases of that panel. If you change something on one of them, it changes something on the other, including things like adding rows or changing headings or anything like that. So in this case, we don't actually want to alias the panel. I'm just going to copy the panel. I'm just going to normal paste the panel at the bottom here. So you'll see that when I copy this panel at the bottom on the footer, we've got paste and paste alias. I'm just going to normal paste this onto the subsequent page. So whilst I've copied the details from the table, this is not linked to the previous table. If I now enter some values in here, you'll see that on the original table, they're not shown, and that's because they're not aliased, they're not dynamically linked. So what I want to do on this table is, this is where the students are going to also have their exercise values entered. So I'm going to add an additional row, and we'll just do this, but this time we'll have exercise. So the idea is that the values from the previous page, the resting exercise, are shown here, but the students can then enter their exercise values here, and then I could continue. I could have another page where I have another table which has them doing intense exercise. So I then have a table that gradually builds up as the lesson progresses. However, we have a bit of an issue here, and that is that if I want the students' values to show here, but this isn't an alias, how do I get that to show? Because at the moment, I want the students' details from here to copy across, but I don't want the number of columns and rows to be linked to the next table. I want to have this one have 1 row. I want to have this one have 2 rows. I want to have the next one have 3 rows, etc., etc. But I want the data to come through. So how do I actually do that? And this is where table linking comes in. So what I can actually do here is, and obviously here I can modify this table freely without it affecting the original table, because they're not aliased. If I lock these cells, the previous table is not going to have those cells locked. But what I can do is actually reference other tables within this LT lesson using formulae. So let's go back to our original table and see how we can figure out how to link to it. When you click on a table and click Edit, at the very bottom in the footer, the table will be given a name, an identifier. In this case, this is table 1, and we have cells A1, B1, C1, D1, E1, F1, etc. So what I need to do is I need to tell the next table to link back to these specific cells. So in this case, I want this cell here is C2. I want the corresponding cell on the next page to reference that. So I'm going to go to the same cell, which is my PR interval, and this is going to be enter the table value, type in an exclamation mark, and type C2. Now, obviously, it's not showing anything because the previous table is not showing anything either. But what I can do, if I now go back to the previous page and I hit preview, I can enter a value here, and it is reflected in the subsequent table. Even though these tables aren't linked via the aliasing function, so that I can add additional rows and columns and change things without it affecting the original table, I can have cells referenced from that table. So we use this most commonly in the good example of this is our glucose absorption experiment. So it doesn't utilize the hard PowerLab hardware. You're just using glucose strips to test your students. But what you have is you have several tables across several pages, each one showing the next interval at which you're going to be doing the test and gradually filling in. So you would have, 0 minutes, 5 minutes. The next page would have another row which is 10 minutes. The page after that would have another row which is 15 minutes. The next one would have another row which is 30 minutes, etc., etc. Otherwise, if I were to just have this table be aliased everywhere, I'd have to have all the rows shown on all tables, and that could get a little overwhelming for my students. So by referencing the tables instead of aliasing them, I am able to have a table that appears to grow in size over time, but all I'm doing is using that cell referencing function. And this allows you to draw values from the same table, for example. What I could do is if I wanted to only plot my PR interval versus my TP interval, I could design another table which extracts the values and puts them next to each other, and then I can just select those for the purposes of my graph. So again, what I could do is add in a table here, and if I wanted to just plot PR and TP, I could reference those. So PR is my C2 cell. And my TP is what? C, D, E is F. And I'm now referencing those cells. I can get rid of this row if I want to. And then I could have those two columns adjacent, and I could have my graph just plot those two without having the middle two intervals that I don't care about being plotted. So you can also kind of pull specific values from an existing table for the purposes of plotting a graph as well. So it kind of has two uses there in having a table that grows as your lesson progresses, but also having being able to plot non-adjacent columns when you don't want to plot the intervening columns, because when you're deciding what data to plot with a graph, you can only select a portion of data. I can't, if I edit my graph and only want to plot PR and TP, I can't kind of select both of them. I can only select adjacent columns. So I'd have these two intervals in the middle that I don't want. By having a second graph that just references those, when I fill them in, that table will be plotted and my graph can plot from that table instead. So there's a couple of nice uses there that we can use when it comes to, it's a secondary way of linking tables across a lesson rather than aliasing them, which again we're going to come to shortly. I can just link to specific cells and just drag values from those cells into my newer tables. Okay, so I think what we'll do, I am just going to take a pause here and we'll have a little look at the Q&A. So let's have a little look and see what we've got. So we have some open questions. So I will answer these live. Let's see how we go. So there's a few questions here, sort of some general authoring questions. So is it possible to incorporate links to external web pages or software and then jump back into where the student left off in LT? Wasn't going to be something I covered, but I'm happy to show it. The answer is yes. You can link to external pages just by highlighting specific text. So just as a really quick example, I'll just click answer live for this one. Just as an example, I can go to my, I'll just hide my, let's just get rid of these black boxes again. So what I can do is go to my text box, go to edit mode and highlight a word or a phrase that I want to be my hyperlink out to an external website. And I need to grab the URL of the web page that I want to link to. And then when I highlight a phrase in the kind of word processing toolbar at the bottom of my text box that appears when I'm editing my my text box, I can click the link icon here, and this will allow me to paste in a URL and create a hyperlink. So if I click done, you'll now see that that phrase has the kind of hyperlink formatting. And if I hit preview and click on that, it will open that tab, open that link as a new tab in my web browser. So obviously I've not navigated away from my LT lesson. It simply opened it up as a new tab. So yes, you're able to link out to whatever websites. You could link to a specific YouTube video or link to a specific page on your institutional website, or a particular resource on your LMS, assuming you have the, as long as you have the URL, you can link out to that particular web page directly from within LT. So when it comes to pasting values into a table, you should just be able to paste the values. I'm not quite sure how well it'll format. There's not an import Excel function. You'd just be copying and pasting the cells. And the third question, if I edit or modify one of the existing lessons, make lots of changes, then change my mind, how do I retrieve the original default lesson? So if you make lots of edits, how can you revert to a previous version if you decide that, yes, what I've done, I hate it, I want to go back to the original? Anytime you open and close authoring in LT for a given lesson, it creates a new revision, we call them, of that lesson. So here's my advanced authoring lesson that I'm using to demonstrate today. If I scroll down on the lesson card, I have revisions. and this will list all of the authoring sessions that have taken place. So opening authoring, exiting the home page, that creates a revision. So you can see here, here's the current version that I've got. So if I were to publish this and make it available to my students, this would be the version that's used. All other versions are shown down here. So if I want to go back to the original, I find presumably the oldest version if it's one of our pre-made ones. Click on it and click restore. That will then treat that version you selected as the newest version. It will have a tick next to it and it'll be at the top of the list. Now, I'm not going to do this now because I'm going to go back into the authoring mode. But you can even click view to see what it looked like for any given revision, restore it, and when you publish, it will be that version that is released, or when you subsequently open it to edit it, it'll be that version that you view and are able to edit. So yes, no older version is ever lost. You just need to go back and restore that version. Just as a word of caution that I think many of my colleagues have iterated during their webinars, once you've published something and released it to students, we don't advise doing any more edits, because once students start a lesson, they are locked into that version. Doesn't matter if you make any changes, you make changes and release the new version. Those that started the old version remain on the old version. So just something to note. Be sure before you publish that that's going to be the final version. Okay, and let's just pop into Q&A here as well. Tables and graphs, if I have two tables on the page and I add a graph, can I choose which table to use for the graph? Yes, so you saw that when I, let's go back into my original version. You saw that when I edited my graph, it said, but on my table, it said use data from here. So I indeed tell it which graph to plot. So again, if I go to my table here, there are now two tables that I can choose to plot from. So if I edit my graph again, what I should be able to do, if I delete the graph and recreate it again, I should be able to tell it which table I want to use. So it says select data, and you'll see that because I have multiple tables, I tell it which table to use to plot, or which table I want to plot as this graph. Okay, so I've answered that one. So I've answered this one as well. Yes, you tell them which table you want to use. We also go to an old version and copy that session to make a new lesson, e.g. as a start for lab 2 or 3. Yeah, you can kind of duplicate an older version if that's what you want to do. You still need to restore the latest version. But if I go to my revisions, if I have the latest version here and I want to take an older version, I can actually click copy, and this will create a duplicate of this lesson. So it's now a distinct lesson. I've taken an older version here, and I can then copy this to another. I can duplicate it, or I can copy it to another course if I had another course. So yes, you can freely view older lessons, and you can copy them or you can restore them. Yes, you can. You can do exactly what I just did there. Just select the old version, click copy, it'll duplicate the lesson. You can then change the name of this or copy it to another course. Okay, good, good, right. So just a few other little tips and tricks that I want to talk about in authoring. Oh, yeah, those are now done. Good. So the next thing I want to talk about is aliasing panels. So this is something I briefly touched on earlier with the tables, but there's probably a few more appropriate options that I can show. So when you copy certain panel types, generally ones that students can modify, You actually tend to get a couple of pasting options. So if I click my panel and copy it using the copy button down here, you'll see at the bottom of the screen in the footer, I kind of get the icons jumping, telling me that they're now there. I actually have two paste options, paste and paste alias. So as I described earlier, a normal paste action replicates the panel that you just created, but it is not linked to the original panel in any way, shape, or form. So any changes I make to the pasted panel will not be reflected in the original. So you would use a normal paste if, say, I wanted to record these same two signals and use the same settings here, but I didn't want the previous data to be showing. I can normal paste this panel onto another page. I copy all of the settings from my PowerLab hardware, but it's not linked to the previous panel. I don't see the previous student's data in my new scenario. However, if I want to, say, create an analysis page where I do want the student's data they recorded on this page to appear, I would use paste alias. So if I go to the next page where I've got my analysis page, I'm going to paste alias my data panel. And let's just resize the pages a little bit. Now this data panel is now dynamically linked to the previous one. You can tell if a panel has one or more aliases by clicking on it and looking at the top right. We've seen the link icon previously. It's telling us this is linked to another panel. But there's also this arrow icon, which means that this panel is aliased. So in this case, when I record data in my recording page here, I record my ECG and pulse, that data will be shown and reflected in this panel. So an aliased panel is not only copying the settings and the configuration of that panel, it actually copies any changes that are made, whether that's uploading a new settings file, or I change the headings, or I add something new in, or the student records data that is reflected in any of the aliases of that particular panel. The same applies for the table that I showed earlier. If I alias a table or a question, anything that's typed into one table will be shown in another. So just to illustrate, I've got my table here, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste alias. These are now aliases of each other. We can see that we've got the aliasing arrow. So as a student, anytime I type something in one, it reflects in the other. If I change the settings of one, sorry, my computer's being a little bit slow there. Should let me type in the cells. This is very annoying. What I should be able to do is modify. There we go. If I change the parameters of one, it's then reflected in any of the aliases as well. So aliasing is something that you can use in a variety of ways. Replicating student answers onto a later page with some feedback is another good thing you can do. So if I go to my questions here, again, I can copy them, and I have paste or paste alias. If I then go to, later on, I've got a little checkpoint here, go to my quiz feedback page and paste alias the question, you'll see that it's aliased. What I could do as an example is I could have a text box here saying, you should have talked about these particular subjects for this particular question. And I've also got a checkpoint in here as well. So what I'm doing here is copying the student's answer across to that page, maybe giving them some feedback directly, telling them what they should have talked about. But because the question's aliased, if I then go to my checkpoint and commit the student will need to commit the checkpoint before they can access the quiz feedback. Because it locks the question answer on the original page, the alias will be locked as well. So just another way you could provide feedback to your students without them being able to change their answer. Or you wanted to provide some additional material on here. You could have their answer here and provide some much more theory on this page. But when the student commits, they won't be able to change their answer because the original alias is locked. The original question is locked, and therefore any aliases of that question will also be locked by the checkpoint. But primarily, you're going to be using aliasing to copy a recording panel and paste it onto the analysis page so that the data the student records into one panel is shown on the analysis page as well, so they can perform some more meaningful analysis. And the same with tables. You can copy a table across so that all the values are drawn through as well. Okay. So the final thing I want to look at is the notebook and the use of the buttons panel. So you'll see that in a lot of our pre-made LT lessons, and I think we've even got it here on these pages, there's actually a little take notes button here, which seems to magically bring up a notebook with that notebook permeating through the entire lesson. As they fill it in, no matter which page they access it from, they see the previous text that they've typed in here. So I wanted to show you how this was set up, but also talk about some of the other features of the button panel that not a lot of people realize, which is what this is. This is a button panel type. So what I've done is I've got my button panel here. I'm just going to show you how this is actually set up. So if we click on edit for this button panel, we'll see that a button is ultimately a clickable image. That's what a button does. Rather than being a static image, it's clickable and it can do one of two things. The way that we've set up the button for this kind of notebook icon is it actually links to a pop-up. So what we can see is I've got the image here, it's not got a pop-up yet. So what I'm going to do is link it to a pop-up containing the notebook panel. Or there should be a notebook panel, maybe I have to make one. So what I can do is we can call this a notebook. And I'm now editing pop-ups here, so I can add in my notebook panel here, like so. And I can make it a little bit larger so the student can, it's got plenty of space to write. Click on OK. So now this is actually linked to the that particular pop-up. So if we go to Pages and go to Edit Pop-ups, we can see we've got our notebook pop-up here. So when the student clicks the button, it will open that notebook page. And this is what you see on pretty much all of our pre-made lessons. So I can hit preview, and you can see that I get a kind of hand icon when I mouse over this image, because it's a button. When I click this, it opens my notebook. If I then want this to happen on the other pages, I do exactly the same thing. I go back and I choose my, and I have to configure it. Click on it, click on Edit, and link to exactly the same pop-up. I don't have to create a new one. I can link to the same pop-up. You can link to the same pop-up from multiple places within the lesson if desired. So I'm going to click OK. And now that's going to link to the same notebook. And I just repeat the process, or I could just copy and paste the panel if I wanted to do it more quickly. But just to illustrate the process, again, I can link to this one pop-up here. Click on OK. And if I preview, so I can test it as if I was a student, I can go in here, type some notes, complete this data recording page, go to my analysis page, go onto my notebook. There's the details I typed in previously, and repeat the process. So there's not anything particularly special going on here. All I'm doing is I've got several buttons that are linking to the same pop-up within my lesson. So It's not multiple notebooks, it's the same notebook just being redirected to from various buttons within the lesson. The button also has a secondary function though, which not a lot of people realize exists. What I can also do, if I click on my button again and click edit, is I can change what it does when I click it. And the other option, other than linking to a pop-up, is to have a file attached to this button. So by choosing file download, I can then pick a file from my desktop, from my computer, and attach it to this button, allowing the students to download it when they click on the button. So the file type is not really restricted. The restriction is that the file can't be bigger than 100 megabytes. So I'm going to click Add File down here and pick a file from my desktop. Let's grab a lab chart file, data file. And this will then attach the file to that button. So I can then go to preview as if I was a student, and now when I click the button, I get a little file download icon. Click on it, and it will download the file. And if you can see in the bottom left, it's downloaded the lab chart file to my desktop or wherever I've chosen to, by default, save my downloads. So it's a really useful little feature. If you've got supplementary material like PDFs, or you've got files or other things you want to attach, you can do so using the button. There isn't a limit on how many buttons can have files attached. It's just any one button can only have a file size, a file attached to it that is no bigger than 100 megabytes. I could have 20 buttons with 100 megabyte files attached. That wouldn't be an issue. So just a nice little feature of the button that not a lot of people make use of. There might be, you might have your original lab materials or your original lab that you want to attach. As long as it's within that 100 megabyte limit, you could attach it as supplementary material. So it's a, like I said, it's a really useful little function to enhance your LT with additional material. You might not want to have your PDF full of text, you know, as its own page within LT, but you can easily just attach it and the students can download it if they want. Of course, you can enter a caption for your button as well. There we go. And I have my little button available. Again, I can copy and paste this to other pages if I want to host it there as well. And just want to touch on checkpoints, as these tend to not be too present within our existing LT lessons, and therefore you might not realize they exist or what they do. A checkpoint serves as a mid-lesson commit. The students will not be able to access the content past the checkpoint until they commit all of the previous pages. So by hitting commit, they lock all of the previous pages. Those go into read-only mode. The student can't record new data, edit their questions, change their answers, change what's in tables. It'll be locked into read-only mode. And once they've committed, they will be able to access the subsequent content. And again, just to note, because the alias of this question on a previous page, I think it's this one here, because that's been locked, the alias is also locked. Any changes reflected in one apply to all others. Just to reiterate how that's worked. The fact that I can't edit here is because of that. I've committed the page that an alias of this question is actually on. Okay. That's really all to cover during this session. Just a few little tips and tricks you can use to enhance your LT lessons in a bit more of a meaningful way, and help you design more complex lessons. So let's have a look and see if we have any questions to look at. So we've got a few questions here. Yeah, you can't. So the question here is, where are we up on identifying where the aliases come from? Sometimes aliasing very similar panels are like an easy way to look at the panel and know that it's linked to another one. It's not really possible at present to tell which panels are aliases of the current panel you're looking at. You can't tell at the present time, no. In terms of where we're up to, I don't know for sure if and when that'll come in. Okay. So the notebook button is only for the students. Can I see it as well in the report? You'll be able to see it in the report. If I go to my report page, we should see any editable panels that the students can change. There's my notebook pop-up there. So yes, the notebook will appear on the page. Any panel that a student could edit is automatically shown when you create your report page. Okay, and these aren't quite questions as such, so I will. Judith just mentioned if you want a notebook page on every page, you can set the basic page once and duplicate the page. So yeah, you could have the notebook sat as a panel on the page if you prefer. We just prefer to have it in a pop-up because you can have a smaller icon and it's therefore a lot less intrusive. Having a large notebook can make the page appear a bit longer. We all know that the longer a page appears to the students, the more overwhelmed they're going to appear to be. If you have the notebook there as well, it could take up a lot of space, especially when it starts to get filled in. So we have it tucked away as an icon for ease of access if and when the students actually want to type any notes in. So it's a little less intrusive as an image, but it's ultimately up to you how you want to implement that. Okay, any other questions that I can help with? The Q&A. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. So Judith says that she creates it once on a page and then replicates that several times. Yeah, you can absolutely do that, or you can click the icon and copy it from one page to another, whichever's easiest for you. Okay, so I'll also just enable the chat again as well. So any further questions, please just put them in the Q&A and I'll be happy to answer them live. So if anyone has any further questions, please put them in the Q&A. One final thing I'd like to mention, we are running a virtual user group called the Brain Trust on the 9th to the 12th of June, I believe. Maybe I've got that wrong. Let me double check. Yeah, so 9th to the 12th of June. So we're going to be running a user group meeting virtually via Zoom. So we're going to have users of LT primarily talk about their experience. Just going to run it as a couple of hours each day, rather than it being a full day over Zoom, which I'm sure most people are a bit tired of. So we're likely going to have a user speak and then have either an ADI design session or an ADInstruments led session. And you're free to attend any and all of those sessions. So yeah, the 9th and 12th of June, so the Tuesday to the Friday, running between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. That 2 hour block each of those days. And anyone who is using LT is welcome to attend, whether you're trialing it or whether you're using it in full. We'd be happy to see you there. And my colleague Marcus has just pasted the link to that, the sign up page and the details page in the chat. So please go ahead and register your interest there and take a look. Yes, it's 10 to 12 British summertime, yeah, UK time. So not ideal for those of you in in New Zealand or Australia or maybe even the US, but if you're more than welcome to attend regardless. Yeah, well, I believe we'll be recording their webinars as well, so we will be recording the brain trust sessions as well. Yeah. Otherwise, if there are no further questions, thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.